In this video, we're going to cover the female reproductive system. In some textbooks and even how it's utilized in ICD-10, it may be linked together as the genitourinary system. And we've already covered the male urinary system. But the female reproductive system, the external structures include what's called the mons pubis, and that's basically the entire region covered by pubic hair and that mound of fat above the reproductive structures in the female. And then the other visible structures of the female reproductive system below the mons include the labia majora, or the major lips, the clitoris. The clitoris has no use in sexual reproduction. It's just a bundle of nerve endings, and it serves strictly as an organ of sensation and pleasure. The inner lips, the labia minora. Then we have the vaginal opening, and the vagina is going to be a hollow muscular tube. And then we have the urethra, and the urethra is going to lead out of the body, and the opening to the urethra would be called the urethral meatus. That is going to carry urine from the bladder out of the body. Now, we can see the internal structures just above this particular picture, and we see the vagina leads to the uterus, and there is a gatekeeper called the cervix that blocks the pathway of the vagina from the uterus. But the uterus itself is a muscular three-layered structure. It's going to consist of an internal layer called the endometrium. It's going to have a muscular layer called the myometrium, which initiates the force of contraction during the birth process, and then an outer parametrium. The male gonad that we talked about before, they are the testes, of course. Well, in the female, it's going to be the ovaries. The testes created the sperm in a process called spermatogenesis. They also, the interstitial cells, created testosterone, the main male hormone of sexual reproduction, as well as a masculinizing effect on the male. But in the female, the ovaries are going to produce the ova, and they're also going to produce the female sex hormones, mainly estrogen and progesterone. The ovaries are paired glands. They weigh about 3 grams each, and they resemble large almonds. They attach to ligaments in the pelvic cavity on each side of the uterus. Okay, we have the microscopic structure . Oops. This is the microscopic structure of the ovary, and here we can see that this is going to be the blood flow to the ovary. It's also going to be the connection to the womb itself. And what we see is during the course of development, we're going to see what are called primary follicles, and that's an ovum surrounded in a casing. And then as it matures and goes through its cycle, we're going to see an increase in what are called granulosal cells. And then the follicle continues to grow larger and larger. Hormones play a role in this continued growth of the follicle. And we then see it graduate from being called a granulosa cell to a secondary follicle. And then we see the maturity of that follicle. At that point, we call it a Graafian follicle. And then during ovulation, it will rupture and release an ovum. That Graafian follicle, though, continues to play an important role in the female menstrual cycle and hormone output, because now after it's ruptured and given up the ovum, The corpus luteum is what we call it. That's what remains of the Graafian follicle. It will secrete progesterone. And progesterone as a birth control hormone has been used because it tricks the female's reproductive system into believing that a Graafian follicle has already ruptured, and now what remains is a corpus luteum that's secreting progesterone. So that's how it can trick the body into thinking that it's already ovulated and work as a form of birth control. But the corpus luteum has a limited lifespan under normal circumstances, and it will actually degenerate and be rid from the body at the end of its lifespan. The primary follicles that we just talked about, there are about 400,000 of them at puberty that are covered with granulosal cells, and about 350 to 500 will ultimately mature during the reproductive lifetime of most women. Okay, when they mature, they are called Graafian follicles. Okay, as we showed here. Okay, they're going to have about 350 to 400,000 primary follicles to begin with that will ultimately mature into an ovum in a Graafian follicle. Secondary follicles have a hollow chamber called the antrum, and the corpus luteum is going to form after ovulation. The ovaries, we've already talked about, are going to form the ovum, and that process is called oogenesis. Okay, it's the mitotic division. It produces a number of daughter cells with equal chromosome numbers, 23, but unequal cytoplasm. There's also a necessity for estrogen and progesterone production in the ovaries, as we mentioned before. Granulosal cells surrounding the oocyte in the mature and growing follicles produce estrogen. And then again, the corpus luteum produces progesterone. Estrogen causes development and maintenance of the secondary sexual characteristics, increased body fat in the breast tissue, on the hips, widening of the hip girdle for childbirth, breast development in general, meaning the ducts that would ultimately nourish the infant. Progesterone stimulates secretory activity of the uterine epithelium and assists estrogen in initiating the menses. Another view of the female reproductive structures, once again we can see the ovary, and we can see its relation to the fallopian tubes, and it's going to be held in place by these suspensory ligaments. Here we can see the muscular vagina and the cervix, again the gatekeeper to the uterus. We can see the various layers of the uterus, the endometrium, which is the inner lining, which is shed every month during the menstrual cycle, the myometrium, the muscular layer, and then the perimetrium, which is the connective tissue outermost layer of the uterus. In this diagram, we can see the ovary, and we can see how the primary follicles are going to go through the maturation process to become Graafian follicles, which house a fully matured ovum, and that ovum, when it's released, will go into the fallopian tube. These small finger-like structures called fimbriae are going to be wisping in kind of a flicking motion to get that ovum to go up the fallopian tube, where ultimately, if a male sperm gets to that point, that's where fertilization occurs. Okay, so fertilization occurs in the fallopian tube, and ultimately, if a male sperm comes into contact with a female ovum and can penetrate the cell membrane of the female ovum, it now is going to implant itself in the uterus, and at that point we would call it a fertilized zygote, and that uterus becomes the life support system for that zygote. The endometrium is richly vascular, And those vessels actually rip away when that tissue is shed every month. But if the female has a zygote implant in that rich endometrium, then those vessels will start to surround that cell to nourish it and ultimately form the structures that are necessary as the life support system for the ever increasing size and needs of the developing zygote. In the female reproductive system, there are also some accessory structures like the Bartholin glands. Okay, they secrete a mucus-like lubricating fluid. Okay, and the ducts are open between the labia minora. Okay, this is just another view of the female reproductive structures. So the labia minora is where we would ultimately find the Bartholin glands. Here we can actually see where they have removed the tissue, but that is one of the actual Bartholin glands. And then we have the ducts right there, which are visible just outside of the labia minora. In addition to those glands, there are the breasts, of course, are located over the pectoral muscles of the thorax. The size is determined by the fat quantity more than the amount of glandular milk secreting tissue. There are lactiferous ducts that drain at the nipple, which is surrounded by the pigmented areola. And there's also lymphatic drainage, which is important in the spread of cancer cells to other body parts. Okay, and here's the female breast tissue. Again, it is a gland associated with the female reproductive system. As we can see, we've got the collarbone. Here we have the ribs of the thoracic cavity. We have the pectoral muscle, and then we have adipose in yellow over top of the pectoral muscle. We see in pink the ductus tissue, and those ducts consist of the ductile secretions from the lactiferous duct and the lactiferous sinus. Those all lead into the nipple, and those are going to be stimulated during the birthing process by various hormones. Prolactin starts the secretion of milk to nourish the newborn. Now, the menstrual cycle involves many changes in the uterus, ovaries, vagina, and breasts. The length is about 28 days. It varies from month to month among individuals and in the same individual. There are multiple phases. The menses, about the first 4 or 5 days of the cycle. It varies somewhat. It's characterized by the sloughing off of bits of the endometrium, which of course is the uterine lining, and as I said a minute ago, it's very vascular, and that's what leads to the bleeding. After the sloughing off phase, the menses, we have the proliferative phase. It's between the end of the menses and the secretory phase. It varies in length. The shorter the cycle, the shorter the proliferative phase. The longer the cycle, the longer the proliferative phase. Okay, and then we get to the secretory phase, the days between ovulation and the beginning of the next menses. Okay, the secretory phase is about 14 days before the next menses. It's characterized by further thickening of the endometrium. That thickening gives a fertilized zygote the potential to implant if the female has a viable ovum and the male secretes sperm during that period of time. The combined actions of the anterior pituitary hormones, follicle stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone cause ovulation, and then sudden sharp decreases in estrogens and progesterones bring on menstruation if pregnancy does not occur. Okay, so this is a concise diagram showing The menstrual cycle, the menses, last days 1 through 5. Small patches of dead cells of the uterine lining slough off, leaving torn blood vessels. Menstrual bleeding comes from these torn vessels. Days 6 through 13, epithelial cells reproduce, repairing the uterine lining. Then day 14 is ovulation. The ovum is released from the ovary and moves into the uterine, the fallopian tubes, for possible fertilization. And then finally, days 15 through 28 are the secretory phase, and the uterine lining prepares for pregnancy, that is, implantation of the fertilized ovum, by growing thicker, secreting and developing greater blood supply. On the last day, the blood supply decreases greatly, causing some cells to die, and then ultimately that leads to the menses, again, days 1 through 5. Okay. This is a hormone chart, and females have a tremendous fluctuation of hormones throughout their menstrual cycle. And here we can see hormone output from the pituitary gland, the ovaries, and we can also see the effect they have on the uterus itself. But the pituitary hormones are going to be released, and they are luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. Follicle stimulating hormone is going to cause the Graafian follicle to mature and ultimately erupt, allowing the ovum to leave the ovary. We can see from the picture just below that the developing Graafian follicle matures in the presence of the hormones secreted by the pituitary gland until ovulation occurs, and then we see a decrease in the hormones of the pituitary gland, but we also see a commensurate increase in hormones from the ovaries themselves. Estrogen hits its peak shortly before the ovum is released from the Graafian follicle, and then starts to taper off just slightly after ovulation, and then it really tapers off during the secretory phase. Progesterone stays relatively low at ovulation, but then into the secretory phase it hits its peak, and that shows the body that the female has ovulated and the ovum has been released into the fallopian tube. And again, this is how the progesterone in various birth control pills can lead to the body being tricked into thinking that it's already secreted an ovum. The female system produces ova. It receives the sperm and permits fertilization, followed by fetal development and birth with lactation afterward. And the production of sex hormones is required for the development of secondary sexual characteristics for normal reproductive functions in both sexes. And that's an overview of the female reproductive system.